You're listening to Breakpoint This Week, where we're talking about the top stories of the week from a Christian worldview. Today, we're going to talk about the ongoing invasion in Ukraine and whether Christians should look at this as a fulfillment of prophecy about the end times and how we can talk about that responsibly. We're also going to talk about the new bill in Florida that governs sexual education curriculum for young kids. Welcome to Breakpoint This Week from the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. I'm Maria Baer alongside John Stone Street. We don't have a lot of time for your jokes this morning, Stone Street. We have a lot to talk about. So is there anything you wanted to tease me about or anything we can get that out of the way and then move into it?
I feel like this is a misdirected sense of guilt because you're the one that always kind of tries to lob some sort of misdirected, unexpected line of conversation. And I'm just, it's going to be great when people can see the video of this because then they're going to know for real that I'm just sitting here with this quizzical look on my face going, what
I like
happened?
to keep you on your toes. It's just, it's part of the art of conversation. Yeah.
Oh,
I thought
good.
you were going to
Thank
tease
you.
me because I told you to watch a TV show this week and you just absolutely do not trust my recommendations anymore. So I'm going to have
That's
to
true.
go the Sarah route. I'm going to have to get Sarah on board so that you watch it too.
She trusts you less on recommendations
That's fair.
than I
That's
do.
fair. All right. Well, I'll
Just
see
for
what
the
I can do.
record.
Okay. I do want to get to it, though. We have a lot to get to today. And one of the first things that we wanted to talk about was there was a piece in Rolling Stone this week about how Christians are talking about the war in Ukraine as a prophecy or fulfillment of prophecy towards the end times. So I want to get to that piece in a minute, but just by way of update. So things are still going on as they have been in Ukraine, which is kind of incredible. Every day that passes is incredible because it's obvious that Putin thought this was going to be something quick, that he was going to be able to invade Ukraine, take over several major cities, and I don't know, move on from there. We're not sure what his exact goals are, of course. But the Ukrainians have really put up a fight. And I don't think a single large city, Kyiv isn't taken yet, Odessa isn't taken yet. A lot of cities are taking really hard attacks. And there's a humanitarian crisis at the borders of Ukraine where, refugees are fleeing to Poland and Moldova and all nearby countries, and that's its own problem. And then other cities, I heard a report yesterday on the Daily from the New York Times that other cities are just completely cut off from supplies. Mariupol has people reportedly that are dying from starvation or dehydration because they're not able to get to food, which is hard to wrap your brain around. But there's also been reports this week that the Russian army is now targeting civilian spots on purpose. So there was a maternity hospital that was hit this week. I think a children's hospital as well. These are the reports that are coming out. So the situation is ongoing and just continues to devolve into more barbaric stories and reports, which is it's just hard to take. And I have no idea what's going to happen. I don't think anybody does at this point. But I do want to get to this Rolling Stone piece. So it's Rolling Stone, so you have to understand the tone going in is not going to be friendly toward Christianity, regardless of what the topic is. And the tone here obviously had, they're poking fun. Like, let's look at these silly Christians who talk about Christianity as having anything to do with the wider world outside of going to church on Sunday. But they brought up, I think, Pat Robertson, Greg Laurie, and some other Christian pastors, some well-known names, have been talking about the conflict in Ukraine and whether it fits into end times prophecy. And I think, again, we can note the condescending tone from Rolling Stone on its own. But I did want to talk with you about this because I think this is a normal human reaction when something terrible happens that we're trying to make sense of. We want to know how this fits into the larger story. And I want to ask you, is that a bad thing to do? Because I know that we want to avoid reading the tea leaves because Jesus spoke specifically about not doing that, and not obsessing over what's the day or the hour, because he said, even I don't know what the day or the hour is. The important thing is to follow the will of God and to live as builders of the kingdom while we're here in the time we're given. At the same time, again, those questions are natural. When something this horrible happens, when a maternity hospital is hit with a bomb, you start asking questions like that. And I think part of it is we want this to feel like it has some sort of meaning. Otherwise, if it's just nonsense, it feels even harder to take. But also because it's scary. So how do you guide Christians to look at stuff like this? Do you think we should avoid talk of the end times altogether, or how do we do it?
There is a good bit of snarkiness that are leveled to anyone who tries to make connections
Right.
to current day events and eschatology. And that comes from two different sides. Number one, it comes from the side of folks like Rolling Stone magazine who don't really have a faith, don't really have a commitment that, and if they do have a commitment to faith, it's this kind of radically privatized faith. That says that Christianity is a personal religion. It's not really something that is true about life in the world. It's something that gives us meaning and purpose, and that sort of thing. And so, in other words, the worldview coming in is one in which there is not a providential hand over the course of history. That
Right.
is a big difference between someone who is a secularist with a religious twist and someone who is deeply religious and thinks, for example, that history's headed in a particular direction, that something's overseeing the course of history, governing it, and that sort of thing. The other place that the kind of the cynicism and the snarkiness comes is from believers who have moved from one eschatological vision than another. I often joke that I've got really strong opinions about this eschatology, how the end times are going to unfold. And that I paid a seminary a lot of money to get those views, although I probably don't have the same view as some of the seminary. So these things actually do matter. But it's like the old joke about Calvinist, of which I am one. When someone finally becomes a Calvinist, you should lock them in a room for 2 years until they get over themselves. Because there's this sense that I've really found it. And that's true, by the way, when someone
The cage
converts
stage.
here or there. Yeah, it is the cage stage. But part of the reason for that is well-founded, and that is that those who have a particular view of the end times have been irresponsible in trying to make connections,
Right.
trying to not only say that this is the view of the end times, but this is how the view of the end times is going to unfold. That's not something that the Bible covers. We quoted just recently a passage which is often pointed to in terms of signs of the end times being wars and rumors of wars. And the very next phrase is, and the end is not yet, And then you also then quoted Jesus elsewhere saying, I don't know the time and the place. Now, to what degree that was a statement of, part of taking on the form of humanity, as Paul wrote in Philippians, I think, was the case of kind of being a part of the human story and what that meant in the incarnation. There's a whole lot of theological ramifications that'll take us down a pretty deep rabbit hole here. What exactly he meant by that, I think, is there's different views on. But one of the things that the Bible is clear about is that it is very difficult, yet impossible with any sort of level of certainty, to make the connections with particular views of the end times and specific events. And so again, recently on our Q&A podcast, Shane and I have been joking about how much I hate the word balance or third way. In other words, don't go to this extreme, don't go to this extreme. Because I feel like whenever you talk about balance, you're going to compromise something. But there is a lesson here for both sides, those who misbehave with eschatology and those who are snarky and cynical about eschatology. And the answer to both of them is we need to think about the end times as the Bible allows us to think about end times. So let me just give you 2 or 3 quick things. Number one is we often use views of the end times to scare each other. The clear teaching of Scripture, and I'm thinking here of Paul in Thessalonians, is that the end times should be a source of encouragement for believers. Second, the Bible doesn't give us, levity to make direct connections with events happening in the headlines with any degree of real certainty. You look at some of these signs, there's going to be wars and famines, wars and rumors of wars. That's been the case since he said it. There's always wars and rumors of wars. And the reason is because of the human condition, not because of particular things in history. The third is just because we can't say with certainty this is exactly how God is orchestrating the events of history. It is absolutely a must for Christians to maintain that God is orchestrating the events of history. Mm-hmm. You know, I was once forwarded an email from a dean of a Christian school, you know, who said, you know, as you're looking to be, teach like a Christian in your class, if you're a history teacher, talk about the providence of God and the defeat of the Spanish Armada, for example. And the person sending me this example was like, you know, can you believe this is, you know, so simplistic and so on. And the answer was somewhere different because, you know, this particular dean was talking about, you know, the providence of God over British history. But the defeat of the Spanish Armada was the providence of God for both the British and the Spanish. Right. In other words, that's the way history is written forward. We talked in our editorial call this week about a book from years ago from Stephen Carter, I think is the author's name. I could be wrong on that, but it's about God's judgments. And he was trying to write a book in response to the way everyone reacted when Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, you know, blamed 9/11 on gays and lesbians. And I think later they did it with Katrina. And Pat Robertson came in the news again this week for going on 700 Club and talking about, you know, the end times here with Russia and the Ukraine. And Carter's response was to say, look, the normative way of seeing calamity in the Bible is God's judgments. Now, saying this is God's judgment and this is why and how he's orchestrating it, that's too far. But to look at calamity as if it's not God's judgment is not a Christian view of history. And I think the same thing applies here. To look at what's happening as if it's not the unfolding of the eschaton this is the normative way Christians have seen things throughout history. And the normative way the New Testament writers saw it was as indicators that God was orchestrating the ongoing flow of human history, which has a culminating point. Where we're at in that in that history or that culmination, we don't know, and it's not a responsible thing to do to overstep that. So we ought not say here's exactly what God's plan is, and we ought not say God has no plan here because He does have a plan, and we're supposed to be encouraged and emboldened by the fact that He has a plan, even if we don't know all the aspects of it.
Totally.
Sorry, that was a long theology lesson.
No, I'm happy for it. That's what I was looking for. I mean, so in this Rolling Stone piece, one of the parts that stood out to me was right at the beginning. The writer says, to much of the world, current events may look like the unhinged machinations of a megalomaniacal authoritarian intent on worldwide disruption. But to Christians of a certain ilk, Pastor Laurie argued that the war could be viewed as something else entirely, a sign of the second coming of Christ. And right there, I was like, now something else entirely, that's interesting because I don't think most Christians would, I don't think those two things have to be mutually exclusive. That Putin is a maniacal would-be tyrant, and this is also within God's plan. And so then I became annoyed reading this piece with my journalist hat on, not even my theological hat on, because I was like, well, this is just bad writing. This is a person who is completely unfamiliar with the premise of God's sovereignty, and for whom, like, he's writing about this argument, this end times argument, in a way that nobody who holds up these arguments would recognize. And that's just bad writing.
And that's common. That's super common. And that's the snarkiness, right?
One of the things I shared when we were talking about this in our editorial meeting this week is I remember reading a book a couple of years ago. This was about parenting, and a woman had written an essay who she had found out she had terminal cancer when she had very young children. And she said something like, I always wondered what life would be like if you knew you only had a certain amount of time to live. And she said, it turns out when you have young children, it's pretty much the same. You just make more pancakes. And she was just kind of talking about, you have to go day to day. You still got to take care of your kids. You got to figure out what you're doing for lunch. You got to do all that kind of stuff. And that to me, I thought of it again this week in this conversation, because I think more or less that's the responsibility of Christians. Like you said, when Jesus gave us this wisdom about the end times, like telling us, like, I will come back. He did give us some information. We're not meant to have no information about it. But that was meant to be comforting. And what we're meant to do in the meantime is to live faithful, peaceful lives. And I think he understood that would feel hard, and that times like this, when things feel really chaotic and sad, that would be especially hard. But I go back to then again to the parable of the weeds, when he says, the kingdom of God is like a man who plants a field, and then in the middle of the night, the enemy comes and sows weeds in the field. And the next morning, his servants say, should we go and dig up the weeds? And he says, no, because you might hurt the seeds in the process. And what you know from that is that there's going to be weeds in the field. Like, there's going to be painful stuff that happens. But in God's sovereignty and wisdom, for some reason, that's how it has to go in order for enough, flourishing to happen or enough kingdom building to happen before he comes back. And that feels like the extent of what we need to know, because that's the extent of what he told us. So I share the concern, because I've seen it as well with some pastors or people who claim to be pastors who make a lot of money talking about the end times, or they've recognized that people will spend a lot of money to buy, the things that they're told to buy, or to buy the pamphlets that'll tell you exactly when it's going to come. And again, there have been people over the decades who've predicted a specific date, and then they're wrong. And so I understand the kind of the instinct to poke fun, but I do think that it misunderstands at this level, the Rolling Stone level at least. It misunderstands the theology behind it. Like, this isn't a topic that's completely ignored in Scripture at all.
Yeah, I think to understand the context, and that is, the more that our culture gets disconnected from a transcendent view of reality and gets more and more locked into being, as one sociologist, Charles Taylor, put it, disenchanted. In other words, seeing everything kind of in this physicalist, mechanistic sort of way, not superintended by any higher power. The more that any sort of ruminations on this are going to sound absolutely batty. They're just going to sound crazy. I remember Russell Moore years ago being interviewed somewhere, and they were talking about, do you really believe that a dead man rose again? He goes, oh, it's worse than that. I believe he's coming back on a white horse to take out the wicked. And it's going to get weirder. We're going to be seen as weirder. And there's some level we just got to be okay with that. And when we're seen as weirder, any mention of it out loud is going to be seen as crazy. And Paul told the church at Thessalonica, comfort one another with these words. So just because people think we're crazy is not the reason to A, talk about each other as if we're crazy, and B, stop talking about the culmination of human history at all. That's also talked about throughout the New Testament as being kind of a source of hope.
John, I want to turn now from the end times in the Eastern European front to the end times in Florida. There was a bill that officially passed the Senate, the state Senate in Florida this week, and that Governor Ron DeSantis has indicated he plans to sign, but as of right now, he has not signed it yet. This is a bill, oh gosh, how do we talk about it? So the media has called it, and the media and activists are calling it the Don't Say Gay bill. But this is a bill that prohibits discussions of gender identity and sexuality as part of the official curriculum in Florida schools for kindergartners through third grade. So it has nothing to do with whether you can say the word gay out loud in a classroom. This is about what's the official curriculum that is put into place in these classrooms. So the bill said that gender identity and sexuality should not be part of the curriculum until at least fourth grade. So this, as you can imagine, has caused a stir. I have when I first heard about it, I wasn't quite sure what to think about it because, again, we've had conversations here before about free speech and how important it is, but also the fact that within a Christian worldview, free speech has to have its own limitations. And I was wrestling through what's accurate about the coverage of this bill and whether this bill is a good thing or not, one of the things I kept coming back to, and then I want to get your thoughts on this, both the reaction to it and also the thing itself. But one of the things I was really thinking about this week is, there was a time when I would have viewed, potential legislation like this, or I would have thought you should view it in a vacuum. So I would see a bill like this and say, is this good? Like, do we need to hamper speech like this? Is this hampering speech? And I would just take it at face value and make the decision. But the reality is that's not the world that we're in. And sometimes legislation is needed because of the conditions on the ground. So this is similar to the accusation that the church often gets, that we're obsessed with sexuality or we talk about homosexuality all the time, when the reality is, if we are talking about it, it's because the culture is too, and it warrants a response because the people in our congregations are thinking about it or wrestling with it. You wouldn't think 20 years ago you needed a law that said you shouldn't be asking first graders what gender they feel like they are, and then also not telling their parents about it. But the situation we're in now, I think it's hard to argue that point. We do need it. I mean, it's just the reality on the ground is, unfortunately, we need something like this at this point. And that's sort of a new way of thinking about it for me, but I don't know how else to approach it. You can't not react to what's happening on the ground, especially when it comes to children. So tell me what your thoughts are on this bill. Is this a good thing? And how have you sort of understood the reaction to it?
Well, tongue in cheek, you said it's the end of the world in Florida, because that's the way this bill has been portrayed. And this is a very important point, because tomorrow Rolling Stone will have an article talking about some reason that there's an apocalypse, imminent because of some act from a conservative. The HuffPost does this all the time. BuzzFeed does this all the time. This and you also get it in some of the mainline.
That's true. They kind of peddle their own. They kind of peddle their own end.
Oh, there's an
stuff.
Apocalypse. Yeah, every worldview has an apocalypse. Don't just like every worldview has a substitute theory of creation, a substitute theory of sin, a substitute theory of salvation. They have a substitute theory of restoration. You remember the 4 chapters: creation, fall, redemption, restoration. To deny any of those chapters is to get reality wrong. But you pretty much go through those chapters. Even if restoration is, some sort of dystopian future where everything falls apart. The Handmaid's Tale, is certainly an apocalyptic piece of literature. And the fragility of the movement that is pushing back and accusing this particular bill of being something that it isn't is one of its features. It's not a bug, it's a feature. It becomes a feature when there's not real arguments to be made. There's no way this bill would have been thinkable 25 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. And that's because of 2 things. Number one is that the ideas that this bill is trying to actually kind of hold in check has been kind of so aggressive that, it's crazy. There was an article written years ago from Michael Cromartie, who was formerly of EPPC, and he was talking about kind of this narrative of theocrats like Jerry Falwell trying to take over the world. And he goes, look, the real story is not that Jerry Falwell woke up one day and said, I'm going to take over politics. In fact, in 1960, whatever, he said, I don't want to have anything to do with politics because my job is to preach the gospel. Instead, he woke up somewhere in the 70s and realized that prayer had been banned from school, that pornography was on the front, of the counter at 7-Eleven, and abortion on demand had become legal. In other words, there was this kind of encroaching, aggressive secularism, and basically looked up and goes, wait a minute, I'm being shot at. I need to do something in response. Now, you can argue about whether what he did was the right thing or, to what degree or whatever, but he wasn't the aggressor in this. Florida Republican legislators aren't the aggressors in this. There's one class total that gets taught from kindergarten through 12th grade. And it ain't math, and it ain't reading, and it ain't history, and it ain't science. The only class that goes from kindergarten through 12th grade in most school districts and state-run schools is sex education. And that sex education now has become not just sexual mechanics or sexual parts, it's become sexual ideology and sexual identity. And it's not teaching both sides. It's teaching these things as if they're foregone conclusions. And as you brought up, and this is really important, pitting the student against the parent in this.
Yeah.
So you got to understand, like, this wasn't a necessary bill. Not only wasn't a necessary bill, it wasn't even a thinkable bill. So you have, on one hand, just kind of this all-out aggression of this ideology. And the second reason this bill is necessary is that the school has now reached a point, and of course we heard it during some of the debates out of the Loudoun County School Board with CRT, and then also, some of these kind of Zoom school board meetings that we're now able to kind of get a glimpse into, where educational officials and teachers are basically saying, and you have also progressive lawmakers now also saying, but that parents have no role in their kids' education. Right. These are both brand new things, and they're very aggressive ideas that make a bill like this necessary. And then you look at it. So in other words, there's a fragility. These things are extreme positions. Extreme positions make the person who pushes those extreme positions fragile, because when you get to an extreme position like this, you've outpaced any sort of rationale. There's no reason, there's no argument. And so anything that's a pushback, you play to be the victim. You pretend to be harmed, and that becomes your number one strategy. And that's what's happening here. The fragility is absolutely incredible. And you're seeing the fragility and, calling this the Don't Say Gay bill. That's insane. All the students, for example, that walked out of, where did they walk out of? Winter Park High School. This bill doesn't apply to them.
Yeah.
They're in high school. This is like saying, hey, if you're under the age of 8, the thing you shouldn't be talking about without parents being present is sex. This isn't controversial in a sane world. Yeah. It's not controversial at all.
So I think the other thing to point out is that what sex ed has become, you alluded to this a little bit too, because you said it's not science either. This is certainly not science. This is not anatomy, which is funny because if it were actual anatomy, which is probably the most beneficial part of sex ed, at least as we used to conceive of it, nobody would be saying like we should teach that to first graders because they can't understand that yet. That's not what you learn in first grade. They're learning to read. They're not going to look at the human body and be able to recognize all the different bones and systems and whatever. I can't even do that. But anyway, there's an organization called the Sexuality Information and Education Council. And so SECUS is the acronym. This has been around for decades, I think since the 60s. They make school curriculum for public schools for sex ed. They've done this for years. I think it was either last year or the year before. They changed their brand. They changed their tagline to this. And if you go to their website right now, secus.org, you'll see this. SECUS, sex ed for social change. They're not hiding this anymore. This is not sex ed to teach you about sex ed. This is sex ed for social change. In other words, John, this is a religion, okay? And what Florida has decided to do is say, we don't think that's appropriate for our kids of this age. And they had to do it. They had to do it because it was happening. This isn't something out of the blue, like you said. This has nothing to do with whatever they're being accused of. I mean, it's silly to even talk about hatred or a feeling of ickiness about homosexuality. This is about not wanting this religion taught to kids that are this age. A, because it's unscientific and untrue, but B, because it's inappropriate for the age group at all, even if it were the scientific anatomy of whatever they're learning.
Yeah. Yeah. Another sign, by the way, of the fragility here is that, the accusation that Disney, who was actually campaigning apparently privately to lawmakers and to Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida's office, they accused Disney of not being loud enough, which secured a $5 million donation from Disney. And so then it's when you start to realize this whole thing's a racket. It's a financial racket to raise a lot of money.
It's so much theater, John. Disney has its own zip code. What are they going to do? Pick up and move their entire town?
Yeah. I mean, how many different places do we want to brainwash our kids? How many different places do we think in order for real change, or what did you call it? Sex education for social change. How many
Social
different places
change.
do we actually think this needs to be done? I mean, it is being done through Disney channels already. It is being done in both subtle and blatant ways. It is being done in every commercial now. The sheer amount of commercials that portray gender confusion or sexual disorderedness far outpaces any sort of even the most generous population guesses and estimates.
Right.
So we need it at school as well. But I also don't want to commit the genetic fallacy. But since you brought up SIECUS, I mean, let's be really clear. SIECUS was founded by a woman named Mary Calderon. Mary Calderon was an educator who had embraced the ideology of Alfred Kinsey. Alfred Kinsey, of course, being the sex researcher who, based on his study of norms for prostitutes and prisoners, then applied it to the general population and started challenging laws, started challenging education, started challenging everything else. So he had the ideas, but he was a pretty icky guy. And culture changes not just with ideas, but also with champions of those ideas. One of Alfred Kinsey's devout disciples was a guy named Hugh Hefner. Artists and educators are extremely powerful in changing culture. Hugh Hefner was the artist of the sexual revolution. Mary Calderon was the educator. The artifacts that these champions put into the cultural imagination were pornography and sex education at all levels of public education. And by the way, the first big grant that went to SIECUS came from Playboy magazine. So you just need to know some of that history to know kind of what we're talking about. But you're exactly right. This has never been about education. It's always actually been about social change. And it's nice to, I guess, at some level that the branding matches the reality. But I think it's important. I mean, the call here for all of us as Christians is to know what this bill says. It doesn't say don't say gay. Good for Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. When a reporter started asking him why the bill said things that it didn't say, he pushed back and said, it doesn't say that. And that needs to be clarified. We also need to make sure we understand this is a children's rights issue. If I were walking down the street, or you were walking down the street with your daughter, I was walking down the street with Hunter, and a man jumped out and exposed himself, or I came across some public act of lewdness or obscenity, or a public official or trusted adult in their life says, hey, just trust me, and then actually proceeds to do something horrific to them, we could put that person in jail. This is a predatory exposure to ideas that challenge their understanding of who they are and their sexual innocence by a trusted official in their life. And we can't do anything about it. That's what this bill is trying to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. John, I want to talk about some of the commentaries we shared this week at breakpoint.org and in the Breakpoint podcast. We were batting 1,000 this week. But actually, in our last conversation about this bill in Florida, I was thinking about this point that you did this week this breakpoint you did this week about trigger warnings. So there was a study that found, trigger warnings are this new popular thing that you're supposed to do when, you're about to read something or watch something on TV, or read a piece on the internet or read a tweet that, might have some subject material in it that could make you feel uncomfortable or afraid or trigger some uncomfortable memories or whatever it might be. You're supposed to put a trigger warning at the top. And then you indicate, this includes graphic content or whatever it is. And this study actually found that trigger warnings in most cases tend to promote anxiety rather than decrease it. And I was thinking about this in our last segment because I think what this gets to is the power of suggestion. And that is one of my biggest concerns when it comes to sex ed being taught at younger and younger ages, and with the sort of ideology that SIECUS brings to the table, which is if you go to a first grader or kindergartner and you say something like, now, are you a boy or a girl? That is such a weighty thing to say to them. That the suggestions behind that is that A, you might not know. B, you can decide. C, your body doesn't give you that answer. And D, I have a right to know and you need to tell me. And we should all be talking about it. There's so much behind that. And kids at those ages are incredibly open to those suggestions. If I went to my 5-year-old and said, would you like to fly to school today? She would think that that was an option because that's how kids respond to the world. And that's how kids learn about the world that they live in is from adults. And trigger warnings to me feel like they're sort of in that same camp where I think there is usefulness. So, for example, I have found since becoming a mom, I can't read or watch anything, especially like fiction, that has to do with children dying, because I just have a really, really hard time with that. And I've had an anxiety attack before, and I just try to avoid it. So a lot of times when people recommend books or whatever else to me, I always ask, this is my one thing I avoid. Can you help? So I understand it in like that conceptual sense, but I do think that a lot of times what's happened is in our overzealousness to add these trigger warnings is it's a suggestion. We're saying you're about to feel very nervous and anxious and triggered. And human experience teaches that that's like telling a person not to think about elephants. They're going to start thinking about elephants. They're going to start feeling nervous and triggered and anxious. And it's interesting that somebody took the time to study it and found that, yeah, that's pretty much the case.
Yeah, as an introvert at parties, one of the things I like to do when it gets awkwardly silent is say, whenever it's silent in a room for 7 seconds, somebody's thinking about Abraham Lincoln. And of course, now for the rest of their lives, when it's silent after 7 seconds, somebody will be thinking about Abraham Lincoln. No, I'm just
having that power over people.
Look, I just think that there's we have to have enough common sense to know that there's such a thing as age appropriateness. There's such a thing as fragility. There's some things that we are calling harmful that aren't. And that doesn't mean that there aren't ideas that are harmful. And we should be big enough to know this. This shouldn't be controversial. We have raised there is a growing degree of fragility in a culture, and it's in a sense a reaction to not recognizing things that were harmful or overlooking them or telling people to get over it or whatever. It doesn't mean we should go ahead and scare everybody with our trigger warnings. I mean, in this list of that the Brandeis students put together, it was just kind of crazy. So like the phrase, hey, man, you're killing it, which is usually a compliment. No, that's triggering. You can't do that. Or, the idea of trigger warning itself made the list of Brandeis students' list of trigger warning words because they were like, it creates too much anxiety.
If this were a Saturday Night Live skit, I'd be like, that's too much on the nose, guys. That's just too silly. You can't go that way. It's just too perfect.
Yeah, it is. So I think that to say that first through third graders shouldn't be exposed to this challenging ideology. I mean, listen, I'll have a conversation with anyone on gender ideology and sexual orientation because it doesn't trigger me. And part of not being triggered, by the way, is being prepared. So if you don't know the difference, for example, between an assertion and an argument, you don't know actually how to think about a particular topic, your belief on that topic becomes really vulnerable, right? When you run out of reasons, you start to yell. When you run out of facts, you start to whine. We see that on so many of the ideas that we're not supposed to question, and the very activity of questioning them, because it sends somebody over the edge. The reason it sends them over the edge is because their position is weak. We should have, and we're talking about grown-ups. We're talking about something called education, which is actually supposed to be about this. We're talking about completely different things when we're talking about Brandeis students and we're talking about second graders.
Totally. Yeah. I want to talk to you about another commentary we shared this week. This was fascinating to me, and I, without even looking at the byline, I could tell you wrote this with our colleague, Glenn Sunshine, because he just is a wealth of knowledge about church history. But this was the response to, attacks or allegations of Christian nationalism in the U.S. And that's become such a buzzword that if you're accused of Christian nationalism, it's almost akin to being accused of being a racist at this point. And you guys really took a step back and were looking at what does it mean to support nationalism, and could that be biblical at all? And you started with that quote from Father Newhouse that you've shared before, where he said, "When I die, I expect to meet Jesus as an American." And what he meant, of course, was that I believe God put me in a certain place and time, just like he put everybody else in the world in a certain place and time. And that's part of the calling he's put on me. And we have no reason to believe that that does not remain after we die, because, and you guys brought up some of the literature in the scriptures when Jesus talks in Revelation and other places about his return, and that people of every tribe and tongue and nation will come and worship God and will fall before the Lamb, which implies that there will still be nations when that happens. So you guys were really looking at what does it mean to be a nation, and what I think the interesting question for me is, how do we respond to that? If we ever take any pride in that, if we ever spend any time thinking about it, is that unbiblical or wrong? One of the strange things I think about our culture asking this question right now is that we do that about all kinds of other things. People are really proud of the culture that they come out of, which is understandable and good and something to be celebrated. People are proud of their racial identity, which can get problematic, but also I think generally is healthy. People can be proud of their gender. They can be proud of their country. But for some reason, when it comes to the country, that's where it gets really controversial for people. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's an easy scapegoat, and people are proud of their race or their culture if it's the right race or the right culture.
Yeah.
And
Totally.
It's also a problem to kind of equate nation with race with culture. I mean, some nations are ethnically, relatively homogenous, but there's a grand difference between race and culture. For example, you could say, and between, nation and race and culture. So to say I'm an American isn't to say anything about race and isn't to say anything about culture.
Right.
What culture are you from? The Deep South, from the North, from the Midwest, from the coast? Are you from a religious background? Are you from a non-religious? I mean, these things are just kind of strange. And what we have basically is a new set of good guys and a new set of bad guys that have been predetermined across the board. And again, this is why it's so important to go back and say, well, what does the Bible say about who's guilty and who's not? What does the Bible say about who's beyond hope and who's not? And the same thing applies here with nation. What does the Bible say about nations? To kind of act proud of a nation, particularly the American nation, and that, or any sort of kind of European nation, is to be beyond the pale. It's to be considered. It's just a kind of a wrong thing to do. And many Christians kind of have gravitated towards this, kind of embracing this categorization, and it's not a biblical one. Nations are parts of God's providential oversight of history, to go back to our very first conversation today. This is Acts 17. Paul says that God determines the exact times and places in which we live. We walk through so many other scriptures, like where does the nations pop up? A lot of people think, well, it's God's judgment on Babel. No, nations actually pop up before that. And the Babel story, which did create even more nations, at least along the line of languages, wasn't a judgment. It was an act of mercy where God was like, you know what? We can't have them all in one place, or they'll think up things they ought not do, and they'll figure out how to do them. So let's prevent them from their own sin nature. Let's protect them at some degree from their own sin nature, at least collectively, and send them away. Now, with languages of science and computer technology, those language barriers are being crossed again, and we're seeing the potential of the human capacity to do unbelievable things that we ought not do, but we have this drive to do it. So that's where the Babel story comes in. But before we embrace kind of the culture's moral indignation, we ought to go back and say, well, what does the Bible actually say about nations? The other thing that I think is absolutely necessary in this is St. Augustine's view of loves, which is that God created us fundamentally as lovers. To love is not the problem, but it is very possible for our loves to become disordered. And they become disordered primarily when I put love of something above love of God. Or I equate love of something, the created, with love of God, the creator. By the way, this is Romans 1. That confusion between creator, creation is right there in Romans chapter 1. Augustine talked about loving it. So love of my spouse can become disordered and can become idolatrous. Love of nation can become disordered and can become idolatrous. That doesn't mean that the love of nation is wrong or the love of my spouse is wrong. It just means that it has a God-given order. And so let's just not jump on the kind of, Christians are just quick to jump on the self-flagellating, bandwagon of,
Totally.
How bad we all are. And I think we just need to be more careful. And this is an example, by the way. The only way to make sense of the chaos of the moment is to go back to the story. So let's go back to what the story says about nation, and that's what that commentary did.
That's cool. I think one of the things that gets missed, just real quickly too, in this conversation is a lot of times the allegation that churches or Christians are engaging in Christian nationalism is based on the fact that we see some Christians advocating for, let's say, legislation or other public policy that reflects a biblical worldview. And we feel like that is, an attempt at theocracy or something that violates the spirit of democracy or pluralism or whatever it is. And we equate that with something called Christian nationalism, and we don't like it. But I think if you dig into that a little bit and you really sit with it philosophically, you have to leave space for what we were just talking about, for example, with the curriculum in Florida, talking about sexuality with young kids. If you believe the Christian story is true and that the Bible is an accurate view of reality and an accurate account of human history and human nature, then you're going to believe that public policy or the rules by which we govern ourselves, the closer that they align with reality, the better they're going to be for all people, whether people believe in that story or not. So I'm not saying that I want to protect Christian kids in Florida in public school from hearing about sexuality because Christians think that sexuality is reserved for marriage and et cetera. I think every kid deserves to be treated safely with regards to sexuality. And every kid, no matter their religious background or whether they grow up to be followers of Jesus or not, deserves not to have that taught to them too early. And they deserve not to be guided in a disordered direction because that will hurt them and that will hurt their families regardless of what they believe. So a lot of times if people are advocating for public policy or something that looks Christian outside of the four walls of a church, we get nervous from a pluralism standpoint. But we're not wrestling with the fact that we truly believe that this way of living, according to certain tenets. Now, there will be limits, of course. I don't think we'd ever support any sort of public policy that forces worship of Jesus or anything like that. But when we're talking about things that we think are best for people no matter what, or we're talking about things that we think people deserve to be protected from no matter what. And for example, children's rights is a great example. We've talked about several situations where the church might be the only institution left that's willing to talk about children's rights when it comes to things like assisted reproduction or gay marriage or whatever else it is that affects children, and the rest of our culture is not willing to talk about it. The church is talking about it. You can't equate that with Christian nationalism in a negative sense. You have to understand that we believe the effects of sin are real for everybody. We believe the effects of living according to the Bible are real for everybody, regardless of what you believe about it. And that's part of what motivates it. It's not some sort of, I just want everybody to live like I do, and I want to hear prayers from everybody around me at dinner time. It's not that sort of thing, but that's often how it's painted.
Right. But we have some guilt in this, right? And in other words, just because there's not something per se wrong with Christians being quote unquote nationalist, and obviously that word's in quotes and has to be defined, or let's just say patriotic, because right now to be patriotic is to be accused of nationalism. But sometimes the way we go about our civic engagement needs to be corrected. In other words, just because we have right intentions doesn't actually mean that we're doing things right. Just because we're trying to stop the bad guys doesn't justify using excessive force. That's the just war doctrine. I get emails like this all the time. How dare you criticize this politician or that leader or this politician or whatever? He has the right intentions, and right intentions aren't good enough. They're just not. They're not good enough for me, and they're not good enough for anybody else. So there's three things we have to realize that we sometimes forget in our attempts to be good citizens or to, influence society. Number one, we need to understand the limits of policy. When all you have is the state, you believe that the state should then, orchestrate life according to the way you want it. That's not what we believe. Not only do we believe that the state ought not orchestrate life the way we want it, but we believe the state can't, and there's all kinds of other factors. So we shouldn't think that we can hit a home run with a particular election or even a particular bill. So this Florida bill, for example, is I think a good protective bill. It doesn't do what the critics say, but it doesn't solve a problem.
Sure.
Right? It doesn't actually fix what we're trying to do, and we have to have wisdom about the limits of policy. Secondly, we need to be careful on how we talk about what we're trying to do. So, for example, public talk about this elected leader being kind of, equating them with a biblical character, I think is inappropriate. First of all, it's a bad use of scripture. Second, you're talking to a group of people who don't believe any of this stuff.
Right.
And this is what Chuck Colson called prudential language. Now, I believe that the Bible itself has power and we can use biblical language. And many politicians have figured out how to do that in both good and bad ways. What I am saying is that if Christianity is true and a Christian moral claim is an adequate view of reality itself, we can argue from the Bible. We can also argue from reality. We can do both. And we need to be able to do both. We need to be ambidextrous. Let's put it that way. And I think also the thing that always has to be prioritized, particularly in cases where we're trying to reverse cultural bads and replace them with cultural goods, is that Christianity is always most convincing and at its best when we do victim care. So there are victims of our bad ideas. Let's take immigration. To say that nations should have borders should not be controversial. It's not nationalistic or racist. Some of the ways we say that our nation should have borders has been nationalistic and racist. We should be able to tell the difference.
Totally.
And because we've said our nation shouldn't have borders or act like it under this particular administration, there's a whole lot of victims flooding in through the southern border. How can Christians care for those victims? I think the same thing is true for the victims of the sexual revolution. I think the same thing is true for the victims of condescending charity. I think the same thing is true for, and just list it out. So in other words, we need to know the limits of our policy. We need to talk about why we're advancing a particular position in all kinds of ways. And we need to also accompany whatever thing we're trying to do with care for the victims that we're of the policies we're trying to either overturn or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good word. Thank you. Let's wrap it up there, John. Let's move to our time of recommendations. I wanted to ask you first, did your friend Shevolinsky, did he win his game last week?
First of all, I know your husband told you to ask me that question, and didn't he?
Actually, can I be honest with you? I know that he lost his game. I just wanted to ask you because I wanted to impress you that I was still thinking about it.
Is that what it is? I think your husband's probably an Ohio State fan.
No, he doesn't really care about college basketball.
It was brutal. I was concerned going in. I thought that it's just a tough environment. They had spanked North Carolina at North Carolina by like 20 points. We're up by 30. Just not that long ago. North Carolina has been bad for the beginning of the year and now have gotten a lot of things together. And they've got a couple players in particular that are just outperforming right now and doing really well. And the emotion of this, the kind of the craziness of this, was too much. So I actually warned my daughter, who is a Duke fan by proxy, as somebody who really likes basketball and loves me. And I said, this could be bad. And it was. So I was concerned about it. And actually, I'm just checking. I think maybe hold on a second. Did North Carolina lose yesterday in the tournament?
Did they issue a trigger warning at the beginning of the game?
Well, the ACC tournament's going on. Duke beat Syracuse, but I didn't see what the score was yesterday.
I just
they were in trouble at one point.
Deeply don't care. You know what?
You just here. No, they pounded Virginia. That's actually pretty good. So I think there could be another confrontation here, and it'll be interesting to see what happens.
Okay, very good.
I mean,
are you
Carolina.
impressed that I remembered
just
to
gotta
ask
respect
you?
It.
Are you impressed?
No.
Yeah, so impressed. Okay, very good. I know I'm such a cool girl because I know about sports. So my recommendation this week, which I feel very confident you cannot possibly object to this, is so the. Are you familiar at all with Brooke Fraser? She's a musician, a singer. She is with Hillsong Worship, but she also has her own. She releases her own albums as well. But are you familiar with her at all? You might recognize her voice if you heard it.
I probably would recognize a song or so, but we sing. If the song was at our church, if the song was written, after the 17th century, it's suspect.
Okay,
so you know.
She has my favorite voice, like of all time, just an unbelievable voice. And she released a new album last week that's called 7, and it's just a live album of worship songs that she wrote. So I just can't recommend it enough and I'll recommend What the Hey, all of her discography. Do we still call it that? All of her music, because her voice is unbelievable. She writes really great, beautiful, thoughtful lyrics, and it's just gorgeous. So that's my recommendation. Now, object to that. Tell me what you find objectionable about me recommending a worship album, Stone Street. Look at him.
Because it dates after the 17th century. So that's what it is. It dates after the 17th century. That's all I think.
Brother.
No, I actually have 2 recommendations.
Okay.
If you are into college basketball, and I know we actually have listeners that are, in preparation for the tournament, there is a great series on the ACC network called The History of the Tournament. It's all about the history of the ACC tournament. And I've been binging through that late at night, and it is fascinating. So well done. And
John,
so anyway,
do
if you haven't
remember
seen that, it's like a 30 for 30. What?
Do you remember when Kevin Ware was a player for Kentucky? Do you remember when he broke his leg?
I do. I was against that was awful.
That was when I took an interest. So sometimes certain things traumatize me. That would have needed a trigger warning for me. I was so traumatized by both seeing that and just thinking of Kevin Ware that I wrote him a letter after that. There's some things I just can't deal with. So that was probably my heaviest involvement in college basketball, is when Kevin Ware broke his leg. But he's okay now. I still follow up with him sometimes to make sure he's good.
This is another example. That was another interesting anecdote, but that was just another example of here we're all talking about basketball.
And you bring
up just some random thing.
No, it has to do with college basketball.
I'm talking about, first of all,
relevant.
Kentucky's not in the ACC. Secondly, that didn't happen in the ACC tournament because Kentucky's not in the ACC, although it did happen, I think, against Duke. No, it wasn't against Duke. I forget who it was.
When you say ACC, all I think of is Arizona Christian College, which is now Arizona Christian University. So that's how little I know about these things. But that's one thing I know about college basketball. That was an appropriate time to bring that up.
Hey, can I also recommend, just as we close out, that Tuesday I am going to be having a great conversation with Katie Faust in our Lighthouse Voices speaker series that the Colson Center is doing in partnership with Focus on the Family at the Family Central Bookstore in Holland, Michigan. So if you're in the neighborhood, come visit us live. It'll be Tuesday night at 7 p.m. If you're not, you can sign up for the live stream by going to colsoncenter.org/events. Actually, you can sign up to come in person or to be at the live stream there, colsoncenter.org/events. It's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to be talking about children's rights versus adult happiness, which was a theme that came up a lot today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's going to be a cool event. Well, John, that's going to do it for the show today. Thank you so much for listening to Breakpoint this week from the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. I'm Maria Bear alongside John Stonestreet. As always, we are going to continue our conversation and add more content over at the Breakpoint podcast. So you can find that wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find links to all the stories that we're talking about today, as well as other commentaries and resources at breakpoint.org. Thanks so much for being with us. God bless. Have a great week.